I'm Gary Jensen, professor and chair of sociology at Vanderbilt University. I'm here today to talk with Ron Akers. I was a student of Ron Akers 30 years ago at the University of Washington when he was a young assistant professor before he became the Ron Akers. Ron's degree is, his bachelor's degree was in secondary education at Indiana State University. He got his master's degree at Kent State University and then his PhD in sociology at the University of Kentucky. He's currently director, Center for Studies in Criminology and Law at the University of Florida, where he's also been professor and chairman of the department. In the past, he's been chairman at the University of Iowa. He's been a visiting fellow at the Boys Town Center in Omaha, Nebraska. He's been a professor at the School of Criminology at Florida State. He also worked his way up to associate professor at the University of Washington. He's best known for the development of social learning theory, but he's also done work on the sociology of law. And we're going to talk today about his background and about the development of social learning theory and the relevance of some of his personal experiences to the choices that he's made. Ron, your degree is actually in secondary education, and so I'm interested in how did you get involved in sociology and criminology, and how did that reflect any personal life influences or circumstances?
Well, I'll see if I can answer those as briefly as I can. I grew up right across the river from where we are right now in New Albany, Indiana, and in the family that, within our family, my brother and I were the first ones to go beyond high school. I was looking at the time for college education that I could afford, which meant I had to get scholarships and other things because the family had no money to pay for any of it, even the cheap state tuitions. Indiana State was the cheapest school in the state at the time, and also I had ambitions to be a high school teacher, because about the only people that I knew that had more than high school education were my teachers. And so that was my vision of it. And when I went to Indiana State, I began taking courses in social studies, which meant history and anthropology and economics and psychology and so on. But I really got interested in sociology, and all the electives I took were sociology courses. In my senior year, as I was ready to go into high school teaching, in fact, I had a contract to be high school teacher and a cross-country coach at one of the local high schools. One of my professors talked me into applying for graduate school at the last minute. I did that and got a scholarship or assistantship really at Kent State. And that's really when I got into sociology and into criminology, was at Kent State. There I came across a man by the name of Oscar Ritchie, who was the only criminologist on that faculty at that time, but was just a brilliant teacher and really inspired people. And I really got influenced by him to go into the study of crime and delinquency as a special field of study. The only exposure that I had to it as an undergraduate, though, was I did take a delinquency course as an undergraduate, and in that course did a book report on 9-short study of self-reported delinquency that they did at Washington. That book had just come out. And so I started graduate school in 1960, and that book had just come out the year before that, or a couple of years before that. And so I would say that reading that book got me thinking along those lines, but Oscar Ritchie is the one that really persuaded me and influenced me to go into criminology.
Do you think that that choice in any way was shaped by and influenced by your experiences growing up in Indiana?
I think it might have had some. I'm not really sure exactly what that would be. As indicated, the family I came from, there wasn't a lot of education in the family, but there was a lot of respect for and a lot of emphasis on education. This is one of the things that were drummed in our heads when we were growing up, is you were going to get an education, because my folks and all my aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody in the neighborhood worked in retail trade or in factories or that kind of thing, and my folks kept saying, we want you to do more than that. We want you to get ahead, they kept saying. And so I think that kind of experience coming out of the neighborhood I grew up in, which was about half a block from the city dump. In those days, it was really a dump. It wasn't a landfill. It was, they dumped it over the side of the hill and into the Ohio River is where it went. And so I think that might have made me a little more sensitive to issues of justice and injustice in society. I know it certainly put me into an atmosphere in which the religious training that I had, the upbringing I had in church, was at the evangelical fundamentalist end of the spectrum, and that is where I draw my religious faith from. And I think that also sensitized me to problems of society and made me more interested in trying to do something to help society. And I saw this as one way of helping to right injustices, to help solve problems, and to just basically do good in society.
Why did you decide on Kentucky? Is it because you grew up in these areas?
That was part of it. Part of it was that, excuse me, that I was, at the time was at Kent State, and to me that was a long way away from home, and I thought, well, if we get back down to Kentucky, we'll be closer to the folks again, so that was a big part of it. Another part of it was just simply what everybody could identify was financial. I had applied for a National Science Foundation, what in those days they called cooperative fellowship, which meant that it was funded by a National Science Foundation, but where you applied was hooked up to a particular university. And so I saw that the University of Kentucky was one of those institutions that you could apply for this cooperative fellowship. And so I did apply for that. I got the NSF fellowship and was on that fellowship for the whole time I was in graduate school. And so those were the two things I'd say that did it.
Who did you study with, and who influenced you the most in your graduate education?
Of course, my dissertation director, my mentor, and the supervisor of my dissertation committee was Richard Quinney. Although in those days his name was Earl, Earl Richard Quinney, and then he went to Richard Quinney, and he's gone by a number of in his publications, ER and all kinds of things, but I always known him just as Richard Quinney. And he was the one that I met when I came to Kentucky. He arrived at the same time I did, again as assistant professor. I arrived as a graduate student, and we arrived at the same time. And he was the criminologist at that time at the University of Kentucky, and had a tremendous impact on my thinking, my way of viewing society and criminology, and the issues that I got involved in were very much a result of his influence.
In fact, your dissertation was in the sociology of law and not specifically in criminology. How did that reflect your experiences at Kentucky?
Well, that was Quinney's influence. Quinney had been doing research on occupational crime, occupational deviance among pharmacists. That was his dissertation research. By the time he got to Kentucky, he was writing and publishing in that area, but he also was moving away from that more into the political aspects of crime, the crime and law, and those kind of things. And at the same time, I took a seminar in sociology of law from, well, it wasn't Quinney, didn't teach it, it was another faculty that taught it, but I got interested in this idea of, well, if we can't, let's focus a little bit away from trying to explain crime and deviance and look at the laws and the norms, how they got there in the first place. What were the norms that came to define this? Well, I was interested initially in doing a study of occupational crime among a number of health professions, not just pharmacists, but a number of others, physicians and chiropractors and optometrists and others. But when I got started into that, it became clear to me pretty quickly that I couldn't do that because I couldn't find any measures of, I couldn't find out how to measure it. There were no data on it, no way to get data on it. So I shifted my focus to saying, all right, let's see if one idea or one definition of white-collar crime is violation of the laws that regulate particular occupations, then what about the licensure laws? How did they get to be there? The laws that regulate and govern physicians and dentists and pharmacists and so on. And so I shifted then to the focus of how did those laws come to be? The dissertation research then became a study of the political power of those professions to influence and in fact write the very laws that were governing them. It was really a study in conflict, political conflict, which again this was something that Quinney was very interested in and was very helpful in that research, and directed me in that direction.
What were some of your other early pieces of research that we may not know about?
Well, I would say, I mentioned earlier that I did my master's at Kent State and studied under a man named Oscar Rischi. He's now deceased, but through him, he began asking me some of the things I was interested in, what I wanted to do for a thesis, and I told him about reading this 9-short book as an undergraduate, and he said, well, why don't you see if you can do some work along those lines. So I decided I was going to do a sort of a retest or a partial retest of the short and nigh research out in that they were doing out in the state of Washington at the time. And so I went into Akron and located 3 schools, one in the lower class area, middle class area, one in an upper class area, and I was going to do a study of class and delinquency, but using this self-report technique, which was just developing. No one knew much about it. And I thought, well, I could at least replicate that part of their study, which they were looking at the relationship between class and delinquency. And they didn't find much. And I said, and my view was they didn't find it because they didn't do research in a big city. They need to be in an urban area where class would really make a difference. And so that's why I went into Akron. I did that study. It turned out that class didn't have any effect in Akron either. And so when I got to Kentucky, Quinney heard what I'd done, and he urged me to write that up and try to publish that. So my first publication was actually a study of self-reported delinquency, class and delinquency, and that, following that, there was an explosion of self-report studies. Mine was actually, I think, probably the second or third one done. And so whenever anybody cited studies of self-reported delinquency, they would string cite short, 9-short, Clark and Winninger, Akers, and then after that other people. So it became a very widely cited article which came from a master's thesis.
Did the fact that you had been a school teacher help you get in to do that research?
I think it helped. I understood what the schools, how the schools were structured. I knew who to go talk to. I knew that you had to go first to the school board or somebody there. And I did. I went there and hooked up with somebody, and then I went to each of the schools and talked to the principals and talked to their guidance counselors and people like that, and pitched it in 2 ways. One, there's a growing problem of delinquency in this society. We need to know more about it. Secondly, I'm a master's student, and I need my data to do a master's thesis, and you all know what that means. So on those 2 grounds, now those days they didn't have all this consent, the informed consent and all that stuff. And they said go do it, and once they approved it, the teachers went along with it, and the students went along with it, and so I was able to go in and I collected the data through going into the classrooms, administering the questionnaires, and having the students drop them in a box, and then I would come back later and pick that box up.
How did you end up at the University of Washington? Did you consider several options at that time?
I did. I had at that time, in those days, if you were a warm body about to get a degree, you had several job offers because of the booming enrollments, and there weren't nearly enough PhDs in sociology at that time. So I had about half a dozen options, but one of those options was not the University of Washington, except Mel DeFleur, who was on the faculty at Kentucky at the time, was a graduate of the University of Washington. He saw me in the hallway one day and said, I hear you're about ready to finish up. Where are you going to go to your first job? And I said, well, I rattled off the options. He said, no, you don't want to go any of those places. Let me call out University of Washington. So he made a call out there, and sure enough, they were hiring. He said, well, I've got a guy here you should take a look at. So I sent a letter out, wrote a letter out to Bob Ferris, who was chair of the department at the time, wrote a letter and sent my beat out, and about 3 weeks later he offered me a job. I didn't go for an interview or anything. They don't do things that way anymore, and I think it's very good that they don't do it that way anymore.
It was at Washington that you first attempted to apply behaviorist principles to the explanation of crime that later got expanded into social learning theory. Right. How did those ideas develop?
Well, I think they were somewhat happenstance, somewhat coincidental. The time that I arrived there as an assistant professor, I was ABD, as a lot of people were in those days that got jobs. And right next to me in an office was an ABD from Washington State University by the name of Bob Burgess. And he had been working with Bob Hamlin and others there on the token economies at Anna State Hospital in southern Illinois. And he had become very familiar with principles of behavioral psychology. In fact, was about as close to a Skinnerian behavioral psychologist that I'd ever seen with somebody with a degree in sociology. And we got talking about commonalities of interest when you're sitting, next door to each other, and you're both in the same, assistant professor slot, working on your degrees, trying to finish your degrees at the same time. We had lots of things in common, starting new classes and so on. So we became friends and started talking to each other pretty quickly about things that were of mutual interest. And one of the things that he was interested in was getting sociologists to pay more attention to behavioral psychology. And my response was, well, you're not going to do that. That's never going to happen unless we can figure out some way in which these principles could be applied to something that sociologists already know about or are interested in. My area at that time was crime and deviance, as well as sociology of law. And I had gotten interested in, more and more interested in theories of crime, although I really was still more interested in theories of law than I was theories of crime. I really wasn't that tied into it. But the more we talked about it, the more we came to the conclusion that, well, one area where these principles might be applied is in the area of crime and delinquency. And Burgess said to me one day, for instance, he said, Sutherland's theory, which he got acquainted with Sutherland's theory because he worked on a delinquency project. He said, for instance, Sutherland's theory, that's a learning theory. He said, but it's not really a learning theory. It could be a better learning theory. And so that was the kind of conversations we had. I went down to the library one day and happened to see in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology and Police Science, it was called at that time, an article by C. Ray Jeffrey. And it was on modern behavior theory and differential association. I got a copy of that. Burgess and I looked at that, decided that it didn't do what we wanted to do, and that we could, what we wanted to do was to go in and really do a thorough revision of Sutherland using these behavioral principles. So that's how I got into it. And so I tutored him in criminology and differential association, and he tutored me in behavioral psychology, so we both got up to par on it. And very quickly began putting this together where we were going through and looking statement by statement of Sutherland's theory and seeing how that could be revised, not just reworded, but actually revised so that you could put in other mechanisms in. So that's really how I got into that. The only exposure I had to that in graduate school was I had read Holman's and didn't think a lot of it. So it really was by meeting and interacting with Bob Burgess that he really had that impact on me.
Now, Skinnerian behaviorists don't like many sociological concepts, such as the internalization of norms and the notion that a free will actor in there being shaped by rules that they've learned. How did you two work together then, given that difference between the disciplines?
Well, that certainly was Burgess. Burgess, as I say, was about as close to being a strict Skinnerian as I'd ever come across. And his view was, well, you don't need those. He took the Skinnerian approach that there's simply a box, so you don't have to worry about what's inside that box. And any time you start positing cognitive or mental things going on in somebody's head, those are unnecessary constructs. You can get to those simply by observations of objective behavior. And I think there's some validity to that, except my view was that, well, you're not ever going to get far enough along explaining human behavior if you get rid of that, because that's one of the things that distinguishes humans from everything else. I recall a conversation we had one time where he said, we don't need these mental constructs. We understand rocks and trees and physical phenomena and animal behavior and all these, and we understand all the things without knowing anything about mental constructs. And my reply was something to the effect, yes, but we'd know a lot more about them if we could talk to them, and we could understand if they did have processes going on, we'd know a lot more. So we agreed that we would try to meld those two. And it was very difficult to do, of course. And some said you couldn't do it. It was impossible to do it because you had such different epistemologies, behavioral psychology and the symbolic interactionism, which was the background for Sutherland. You couldn't put those two things together. But we felt we could, and we felt that really you could take the cognitive and processes, the behavioral processes, and meld them in a way that would make some sense. And one of the things that gave us a clue to that was I was reading a paper, and I can't remember now who it was, but it was an article by an operant conditioner. I believe it was a study of pigeon behavior, trying to account for how these pigeons were behaving in a particular way. And his argument was that, well, they were being influenced by proprioceptive stimuli that were acting as discriminative stimuli. And I said, what is proprioceptive stimuli? I'd never seen that term before. So I went and talked to Bob about it, and we looked it up and began trying to study it. It turned out basically talking about internal stimuli. And so my notion was, well, if that's true, then why can't we think of definitions, attitudes, mental constructs, and so on as internal discriminative stimuli, as well as actual behavior? If overt behavior is behavior, then why can't covert behavior also be behavior, learned by the same processes? And how would those two things go together? And so that really is the way in which we came up with this notion of the definitions as discriminative stimuli. These are internal discriminative stimuli. They're also external because other people say these definitions, other people express these attitudes, and therefore they are external in that sense. But they're also internal, along with the physical setting, the people around you, and so on. All these are things that are discriminative for behaving in a particular way in a particular situation. So I felt we had to be faithful to Sutherland, else it wouldn't be a revision. And I felt we had to be faithful to behavioral psychology principles, else it wouldn't be a revision, just simply have two separate things. It was not easy, but I believe that we did accomplish it. Many people disagree with that, but I felt that we were able to put those two things together in a way that added to both of them.
When did you first start calling it social learning theory?
I can't answer that exactly. It seems to me that we were using those terms, Burgess and I were using those terms pretty early on. As a matter of fact, if we went back and looked at the original Burgess and Akers article in '66, we would probably see it in there someplace. I haven't done that, but if we went back, we'd probably see it. But I explicitly and self-consciously began using that term fairly early on. When I began working on my deviance book, I first started working on that in 1968, the summer of 1968. By that time, I had decided I was going to call it social learning. So from within that 2-year period, from '66, when the time the article appeared, to the time I began working on that book, I had pretty well decided I was going to refer to it that. Although the differential association / reinforcement, I always felt that was an accurate term, I just felt it didn't convey enough. It was cumbersome, and it didn't convey what I wanted to convey. So fairly early on, I started using it. Exactly when I first started, I can't tell you. I had read Bandura. I knew about Bandura. But the things I'd read about Bandura, this was before he came out with his book on social learning theory. He and Walters had some things on aggression and on modeling and that kind of thing. But I didn't really take it so much from him. I took it using the terms, had seen the term and used it before that. Although once I recognized it basically was pretty much the same as Bandura's theory, certainly from the same kind of background, because Bandura also puts together the cognitive and the behavioral. I felt we were moving in the same direction, so I recognized that it was pretty much the same general genre of theory that Bandura and other behavioral psychologists who weren't strict Skinnerians but were more social behaviorists. Then that's when I really began recognizing and using it even more.
Was it pure chance that the two major perspectives of the last 3 decades in sociology were developed by 2 assistant professors at the same university, University of Washington, you and Travis Hershey?
I think it was happenstance. I was there before Travis arrived, and I remember us hiring Travis. I don't think I was on the committee, but I certainly was very supportive of him and voted in favor of him, and saw right away that this was really an exceptional person to have. I mean, other than that, I didn't, at the time, his book was not published. He had just finished his dissertation, and his book had not yet, I don't believe his book had yet come out. It probably was in press or something. So I don't recall ever thinking, well, this is a major theorist that we need to get here. Here's a really, really good sociologist who really understood delinquency, who really understood issues of crime, deviance, and that I thought would be really, really a good person to have. So yeah, I think it probably was happenstance that he came. I believe it was 1968 when he was hired. He came in '69, I believe is when he started. I think it was '69, something like that. And I'd been there about 3 years, and Burgess and I had already done our work together. And Travis came along and when I first read the book, I said, boy, this is brilliant. This is really, really good stuff. So, but other than that, I don't know. He came from California. I came from Indiana. I mean, I don't know happenstance of what I have to say it would be.
Were there any conditions or characteristics of the field at the time that might account for social learning and social control?
Yeah, I think if you back up and say what was the intellectual climate of the day, then it's not. I mean, the happenstance was that we were at the same place about the same time in similar, junior level positions. But at that time, in the 60s, there was a general questioning of just virtually everything. And there was a movement in the sociology of crime and deviance to revise, revamp, come up with new ideas, try to move ahead in terms of understanding law, social control, and criminal justice, which is, well, that was a big push. For instance, Bill Chambliss was there at the same time as well, and one could say, not just two, but three. What about Bill Chambliss? He was developing his ideas of conflict theory at the time, and was really moving along the same routes that Quinney had been moving at Kentucky. And so, I mean, I thought Bill's ideas were terrific as well. And he was doing the same thing. He was questioning what had been going on before. He was questioning. He was trying to come up with some new ways of looking at things. And so I think that intellectual climate, it was, labeling theory was being developed at the time, and it was around before then, but it was really being developed in the 60s. There was questioning about the traditional social disorganization, anomie, functionalism. That was all being questioned. And I think there was a movement in my case, and I think Travis as well, to get away from just purely structural explanations of things and get back down. If you're going to account for the behavior, try to get down closer to that behavior. Although his theory, I think, was more structural than mine at the time was. The one I say mine, Burgess and I, the one we were working on. So I think there was something in the intellectual climate that we all came out of graduate school about the same time, and that's what we had learned from our professors, people like Quinney and others, that there needs to be some new thinking. And so that, in that sense, that wasn't so much happenstance.
You've mentioned Travis and Chambliss and Bob Burgess, and what other colleagues there or faculty there did you work with and influenced you? Did Schrag have any influence?
I'd say there are two others that besides those two that really I worked with and learned a lot from. One was Clarence Schrag. Clarence Schrag was really best known for his impact on his students. I mean, he turned out some very, very terrific students. And he had some very good ideas about theory and what is a good theory, and how do you analyze theory? How do you judge a theory, if it's any good or not? Does it explain anything? And the other person then was Norman Hainer. Norman Hainer was an old University of Chicago sociologist who was at retirement age when I got there, but he was had been interested in corrections for many years, and I got to talking with him and just became friends with him. And he was interested in doing studies of prisons, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the more I worked with him, the more I got interested in that. And he and I collaborated then. We got a grant from NIMH to do a cross-cultural study of prisons. And we did that in the United States, in Mexico, in England, Spain, and Germany. And to my knowledge, it's still one of the few cross-cultural studies of prison structure and organization. So those were other two people. I think Otto Larsen I have to mention as well, who's not a criminologist, but Otto was a very good friend and an influence on me as well.
Where did you move after? I know you left University of Washington, and what other colleagues in your next set of moves influenced you?
I went from University of Washington to the School of Criminology at Florida State. Although that time it was not yet a school, it was in the process of becoming a school. It was still a department when I first talked to them, but it was in the process of becoming a school. And there, already on the faculty, there was C. Ray Jeffrey, who I had a great deal of respect for, and was, as I told you, had read that article he had written in '65 on behavior theory. It turned out we had very different ideas of which directions to go with that, and he, by that time, is already moving more and more in the biological direction. And so I would have to say that we were good colleagues, but that probably the directions we took, he probably didn't influence me that much in what I did with the the development of the ideas and so on. But the other person that was there that I felt I really got to know well and learned quite a bit from was Charles Welford and Ted Chiricos and Gordon Waldo. Those were people that I felt were doing very good work, and we found a lot of things we had in common. Now, it turns out I never did any collaborative work with any of those people, but I did feel that was a good time for me there.
Tell us about your students. I know you've chaired the committees on dozens, and I don't know if you've even kept track, but just tell us about some of your students, and especially those that may have carried on and elaborated on the social learning tradition as well.
Well, one of the things that I've tried to do through the years is to avoid, the way I like to put it is, I want to educate, I don't want to indoctrinate. So I've made a point not trying to recruit disciples. I've tried not to say, all right, if you're going to be my student, you have to be a social learning theorist, or you have to do something in that area. I've always encouraged students to look at those ideas, and if they wanted to develop them, fine. If not, so I would be hard-pressed to say, here's a student that I trained to be a social learning theorist, and that's what they are. I don't think I can name any. But I've had a number of very good students, and I'm going to start with you because you were my first doctoral student. I think you got your degree 71 or 72 or 71 around there, and you were the first doctoral student I had, and I don't think that I indoctrinated you. I think you pretty much developed your own ideas and went along your own path. I think you know about social learning theory, but you also know control and bonding theory, and you've done work in both those areas. So I would start with you. I think you're. I point with pride to you as my student. I've had other students along the way, both in the sense that I've been their dissertation director, or I've served on their committees, or I've worked with them in a way in which I feel that I can sort of count them as my student, not mine exclusively. They're students of other people as well, just as you. I mean, you have the almost unique thing of being both the student of both Travis and me at about the same time. So you're as much, I guess, Travis's student as you are mine, but I was a director of your dissertation, so I put first claim on you. But I've had, for instance, Marvin Crone was a student of mine when I was at the School of Criminology at Florida State. Welford was his dissertation director, but I was on the committee, and years later, Marv joined me on the faculty at the University of Iowa, and we did a lot of work together, and so I sort of think of Marv as one of my students. I think, would mention Lanza Caduce, who was a student of mine at the University of Iowa, and who is doing work. He's now on the faculty at the University of Florida with me, and he's done a lot of work. We've done a lot of collaborative work together in social learning theory, just as Marv has. Marv has continued to work in that direction, although he's gone off on his own path as well. So has Lon. Lon has continued to do that. Lon has remained more in sociology of law than he has in learning theory and crime. So those are two, in addition to you, that come to mind immediately. I haven't sat down and gone through a list of these, but those are people that come to mind right away. In more recent times, I have a student by the name of Bill Skinner at the University of Kentucky, just right down the road here, who I wouldn't call him a learning theorist, but he knows learning theory, and he's done a lot of work in other areas. He's also from the University of Iowa. I have a student who people don't know in the field because she's gotten out of the field, Marcia Radosevich, who owns her own company in Boston now and is worth a lot more money than all the rest of us put together. But she was a student of mine that I'm very proud of. The students I've had at University of Florida, I just had the occasion to go back and look at all the students I've had just in the past 10 years, and I've been on 64 committees in the past 10 years. 30 of those I was the chair, counting masters and doctorates. So you're right, I've had a lot of students. But among the ones that stand out, and I'll probably leave somebody out, and I don't want to do that, but among those that stand out in my mind are students like John Cochran, who, again, knows learning theory. I wouldn't call him a social learning theorist, but he's done a lot of good work on that and other theories. Christine Sellers, they're both down at South Florida, University of South Florida, in the Department of Criminology there. I think I would mention Linda Smith, who's at Georgia State now. These are students I've had in the last 10 years.
Was Rand Conger one of your students?
Rand Conger was actually Burgess' student.
Oh, Burgess.
He started off as Burgess' student, but I did know Rand at University of Washington, and I worked with him, and he has probably stayed more in this area of learning theory than anybody else. But I was not on Rand's committee and was not his dissertation director, although I think he probably did take one of my classes. Yes, he was a student there at University of Washington, but I think started off more with Burgess than with me.
Who've been your major critics in the field? I know some of them are colleagues and friends, and maybe students.
It's to me interesting that yes, the critics, colleagues, and friends are kind of in the same boat. It's kind of the same camp. I know in the early days, one of my strongest critics was Bill Chambliss. He thought that what Burgess and I were doing was ridiculous. That you can't put Sutherland and Skinner together, and you're asking the wrong questions. Those are the wrong questions. We don't really need to worry about why people are committing crime. Everybody does that sooner or later. Everybody does engage in deviant behavior. The real question is, what is the structure of society, and how does that have an impact on law, justice, and crime? Bill was an early critic and used to get on our case about it. Schrag was a critic of what Burgess and I were doing because he felt it was tautological. He's the one that first, he and Chambliss were the two that jumped on us about tautology, which we can talk about that later if you want to, which I think we found a solution to, but they were right. We had a problem there. But I would say, and Travis has been a critic of mine, just as I've been a critic, not a critic of mine, a critic of the ideas. He's never been a critic of me. He's been a critic of some of my ideas, and I've been a critic of his ideas. But we have remained good and close friends through all these years, and Travis had a big impact on the way I view theory and the way in which I approach the study of crime and deviance. And so, yeah, he's a good friend, a colleague, also a critic. Through the years, I've had people like, I think C. Ray Jeffrey's been a critic of mine. Again, I was a colleague of his. So, yeah, I think in some ways those are all in the same category. I guess if you can, if your friends and your critics can be the same people, then probably things are not too bad.
What criticisms do you think reflect, in your opinion, a misunderstanding of your theory? Well,
the one that comes to mind immediately is the one that I published a paper on last year on this so-called cultural deviance notion. I think the notion that differential association is strictly and purely the ideal model of a cultural deviance theory, I think that's wrong, and that's what I've iterated in that article. But if it applies to that at all, it certainly applies not at all to social learning theory. And yet those who continue to think of this as cultural deviance theory put social learning in there right along with the original differential association, in spite of the fact that it overcomes virtually all of the problems that were attributed to cultural deviance. I don't think Sutherland was actually cultural deviance either, although I think culture was a big part of his theory. And cultural aspects remain a part of social learning, but it's not cultural deviance, and I think to me, that's the biggest error in criticizing. Tautology, I think, is also not correct anymore. I think when it started out, there was a problem with that. I think that's been resolved. The other criticism, which I think is a misunderstanding, is the notion that the theory, both Sutherland's theory and social learning theory, posits only one-way causal processes, that the social learning variables create the delinquency and the delinquent behavior has no feedback effect at all. I think that's completely wrong. The very concept of reinforcement itself is a feedback concept. Behavior has consequences, consequences feeds back upon the behavior. So one could say the behavior creates the consequences as well as the consequence creates the behavior. It's an ongoing process. So, in fact, I'm reading a paper at these Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences tomorrow in which I address that issue. So I think that's probably not an accurate criticism. I think that's a misunderstanding. Those are the two that come to mind right away. If I thought for a while, I could think of some others, but those are the two that I think are misunderstandings. I think